I'm still riveted by our lunchtime keynote, and I'm so excited to see and hear from our next presenters. I'll fly away how we move forward from here. So our moderator will be Bethia Carter, President and CEO of New England's Blacks in Philanthropy. But our panelists today are Belvie Rooks, author and educator and co-founder, Growing a Global Heart, who will be speaking Heartbreak, What Would Healing Look Like? Following Belvie Rooks, we have Kabir Hypolite, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's from the Board of Directors of Peace at Any Pace from Oakland, California, speaking on In Search of Hippolytes, Making Sense of My African and Native American Ancestry, followed by Loretta Brady, Professor of Psychology and Director of Re-Equity Labs at St. Anselm College, who will be speaking on Rivers of Health, Campus Explorations of River Ecology, Enslavement, Economics, and Health Equity through Games. Please, I would also direct your attention again to the full biographies of these wonderful panelists, which are in the online program. So thank you so much, and we'll begin with Belvie Rooks.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Great. It's a real honor. And let me just check in terms of time. We each have about 10 minutes. Is that it? Right.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I'm going to, in the context of introducing what it is that I have to say, I just want to begin by saying that I feel that so much of what is calling as it relates to the way forward has to do with our expanding our frames of reference. And I just want to share kind of a big picture context of what I feel that means and looks like, or at least for me. And it's a quote by mathematical cosmologist Brian Swimme, who says that the great discovery of contemporary cosmology is that the universe for 14 billion years has been working to bring forth vibrant human communities. Our human role in this process is the healing of personal and collective wounds so that we might revel even more deeply in the magnificence of our differentiated unity, the emphasis being on wholeness and oneness, and differentiated unity is not an antagonistic relationship.
Sorry, one moment. I just realized I'm getting some notes. We're unable to see you. Maybe that's intentional, but if your camera is off.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, there we go. All right, great. Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you, but yes.
No. I need to. So I cleared that. So
Great. We see you. We see you clearly now.
But I just want to say that also a cultural historian whom I have a great deal of respect for and have spent some time with before he passed, and his book Dreaming of the Earth talks about the challenges confronting us, our species and the planet at this moment, is that we are in between stories. And by that he means that we are currently in a space between the old reductionist Western materialistic paradigm based on compartmentalization and separation, and an emerging new story rooted in cosmic and an indigenous worldview that privileges the whole in much the same way that Chief Bimbola kind of related as he did the opening and the framing in terms of African wisdom tradition. So, and what does that mean? And what I'm going to use today to share and just to get through quickly, there's the discussion about the whole and our interrelatedness and our oneness. And then there's the reality of our separate and our very different journeys in this 14 billion year old unfolding universe. And In 2007, I had the occasion, my husband, then husband, who passed in 2015, we were married in Accra, Ghana. And one of the things that we did shortly after we were married, we had planned to visit the slave dungeon at Elmina. And people said to us, "You're on your honeymoon. Why would you go to a slave dungeon?" And our response was that, you know, coming from where we came, that for everybody in this part of the so-called New World had at some point had some ancestor who had come through one of the more than 100 slave dungeons along the West Coast. And so we were really going to honor, in honor of them. And I will just read a little bit from my journal, because then by reading it, we can get through it. After the ceremony, Didan and I traveled to the Cape Coast of Ghana. The news was filled with stories of thousands of people being misplaced after a heavy flood in northern Ghana. When we saw the images, it reminded us of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We continued on to Elmina, the slave dungeon, however. Belvy's journal, Elmina. As I stood looking out at the vast ocean beyond, I tried hard to imagine what reaching this spot, this door of no return, must have meant and felt like for some long ago unremembered African ancestor as she stood trembling on the precipice of a terrifyingly unknown and uncertain future. One of the most horrifying bits of information shared was the fact that at the height of the slave trade, there were so many dead and dying bodies tossed into the sea at this very spot that the frenzied feeding opportunity resulted in the change of the shark migration pattern along this entire coast. Tears flowed uncontrollably. I sobbed as I glanced at the ocean a few feet below. It was hard to process. For over 300 years, without interruption, millions of African men, women, and children had begun the long journey into slavery from this spot. The names of the people passing through the door of no return have all been erased from our historical memories. The names of the mothers and the fathers and the children, the babies, the aunts, the potters, the weavers, the farmers, the priests, and the healers, most of whom were women. The numerous slave dungeons, over 100 on the west coast of Africa, in places like Elmina on the Cape Coast of Ghana and Gorée Island in Senegal, are living monuments and stark reminders of our inhumane history. For a couple of days, the tears flowed uncontrollably, particularly after I had gone to sit in the women's dungeon, and I had gone to sit alone after the guided tour, because I just felt that I wanted to bear witness and to all of the suffering, as we heard about the young women being taken up to the governor's mansion. And I think after all of that, I just fell apart. My beloved new husband, really after about 2 days, came to me and knelt down and said, what is it that hurts so bad? And I explained that what hurt so bad was the ship, the investors. We knew what dates they arrived. We knew when they left Rhode Island. We knew everything except who the people were. And that the wound of erasure on this journey, particularly for those of us of African ancestry in the New World, was the wound of erasure. I didn't feel as though it would at the time. He took my hand and said, what healing looked like? And I realized that was not a question I wanted to hear because I was into the wound. But what it did is it reminded me of something that the African elders had said to us before we went into some of the Ghanaian elders, when they realized we were going to slave dungeons. They had said that when you come out of the slave dungeon, make sure you try and find the nearest body of water, hopefully moving water, to wash your feet and to do a ritual cleansing of your feet, because you do not want to walk with all that sorrow. And I realized that I had actually gone to bed and cried. But so the very next morning, I got up and I remembered their instruction, and I remembered the power of ritual, and mostly the power of following what the elders, the guidance. Weeping and remembering and trying to come to grips with what it was that hurt so bad, that there were millions of people who were just erased and unremembered. And as I washed my feet, I kept hearing at some point a recurring phrase, plant a tree. And I kept washing my feet and doing the ritual, plant a tree, plant a tree. And I realized at some point that that was one of Alice Walker's poems that I knew very well. When they torture your mother, plant a tree. When they torture your father, plant a tree. When they torture your leaders and assassinate your leaders, plant a tree. But in that moment, I understood that it was the ancestral alignment and the elder wisdom of doing the ritual that I was being guided to plant trees in memory of all of these forgotten ancestors. And when we went on back to Accra, we started planting trees. We came back to the United States. We planted trees along the Underground Railroad, along the Civil Rights Trail. We planted trees in Canada. And so the question of healing was when we were invited to Selma. Bob Moses was alive then. He came to the tree plant. We were invited to do a tree planting ceremony at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the annual remembrance of Bloody Sunday. And, you know, Dick Gregory, lots of people who came to this tree planting ceremony. But what came to mind for me, Confederate soldier. And it was like that persistent, what about the Confederate soldier? The short of it is there was a Confederate cemetery across the way, across from where the African Americans mostly had gathered in honor of the Civil Rights Movement. But I felt like the persistence of the question, I ended up never thinking that I would go into a Confederate space. But I took one of the trees that we had planted at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge with me. And I went alone, since my husband said, you know, this was my journey. I think it was one of the more frightening things that I've done, and I don't actually understand now even why I did it. A lone Black woman in a Confederate cemetery with a as I looked down at the grave sites, I found myself standing up over the grave when I calculated the birth and the death of a 16-year-old. And I don't know what I thought of Confederate soldiers were, but I never thought that they were 16-year-olds. And it reminded me that here was a person who had a child. I never thought, you know, I don't know what I thought Confederate soldiers were, but not children, who had given his life to me enslaved child. But then I also thought about my relatives who had gone to Vietnam as young men at 17 and 18 years old and had done terrible things to the Vietnamese people and women as soldiers. And in that moment, I saw and felt that they were both equally innocent and both equally guilty. And that is, I chose to place the tree side. What it said to me was, as I looked at the gravesite, what about the journey from the West Coast and the significance of the tree, is that I had selected a symbol of the tree that breathed for the whole. It did not say, you're a Confederate soldier, you can't have any of my oxygen. I realized that the symbolism was one that has now tried to, in the course of the work that I'm doing going forward, trying to focus more on the healing of the whole in the context of our individual suffering.
Thank you, Dr. Rooks. Thank you so much. That was so moving. And as we think about trying to move forward from this space and that planting of the tree and the part of the spiritual cleansing, I think that's something that all of us can engage in. Hi, I'm Bethia Carter. I'm the moderator for this session. I apologize for being late. I was having technical difficulties, but I am here. And we are delighted to have the speakers that we have today. And as we move forward through this journey of how do we move forward from here, I'll fly away. That tree, that root is giving us that space to move upward to the sky, to see where can we go from here. And next we'll hear from Mr. Kabir Hoplite, who is a writer, a father, a historian, a spiritual person that will talk about his journey as well. Mr. Hoplite, can you share with us?
Well, good afternoon. I think on the East Coast, it's still morning here in Oakland, California. My last name is pronounced Hippolyte, just so people know.
I apologize, Mr. Hippolyte.
It's mangled quite frequently. So let me just say thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be on the panel. This is my first time ever being invited to be on a panel. And certainly one of this auspicious nature is quite an honor. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you. I'm also just reflecting as I was listening to Belvie Brooks talking about erasure and healing and trees. There's a woman in New Orleans, Dr. Selassie, I can't think of her full name right now, but she had an expression that I heard recently that just kind of resonated. She said that the axe forgets, but the tree remembers. And I think that's sort of poignant and fitting right now. So I just want to read a little bit here what I prepared for you. I was thinking about the title of this panel, I'll Fly Away, and how we move forward from here. And I noticed that the title is in two parts. Flying away, which to me suggests escape or fleeing something, setting out on an adventure, an involuntary adventure perhaps, as in our case, and seeking one's own liberation. The second part poses the important question of how we move forward from here. And it invites us to take stock in ourselves, to be mindful of the manner of our flight referenced in the first part. And I believe it necessarily requires us to define personally and collectively our notions of time and space as we move forward from here as people of the African diaspora in the Americas in the 21st century. So I'd like to begin by recognizing where I have been and where I come from, because I believe the personal is political. So I should tell you that my parents were born in the deepest South, Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, Louisiana. But the history of these cities begins with French and Spanish colonial influences, not British or American. So I also grew up in the far-flung edges of the diaspora. My father joined the military at roughly about 18 years old. My parents met in the military, and my brother and I were born in Spokane, Washington. We lived in Prescott, Maine. We lived on Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and he retired finally after 27 years in San Jose, California. So much of our experience has been on the sort of the far edges of the diaspora. So I may have a somewhat unique lens on the question of what I'm flying away from. I also want to say that in Ghana, the Akan people offer us the wisdom of the Sankofa symbol and an elaborate heart-shaped symbol, and often a bird looking back over its shoulder with a seed in its mouth. In sum, it reminds us that to know where you are going, you must know where you have been. You must know who you are. And that kind of awareness has been difficult to acquire in America because of systems that erase and distort our true identities, and because of generations of intellectual, intercultural, and biological mixing. We have been cut off, dispersed, transformed, miseducated, but nevertheless, the truth of our being runs in our veins. And so Sankofa urges us to go back and find and claim what we sometimes mistakenly believe has been permanently stripped away and lost. You mentioned I serve as the board president for Peace at Any Pace. I should just mention that our mission is to offer healing of intergenerational and ancestral trauma of multi-generational people of the African diaspora through culturally specific journeys, theological mapping, storytelling, drumming, mindful awareness, and meditation. We believe each of us is our ancestors, and that our ancestors are speaking through us and to us through our awareness and our intuition. And just before I forget to say it, our website is www.peaceatanypace.org. You can find more information about us there. So the other important concept that I wanted to mention is that of what I call the intelligent fish. It's not a phrase that I originated, but it's not one that I hear very often. The intelligent fish knows the waters in which it swims. This is the analogy that tells us that not only must we know ourselves, but we must know and understand our social, political, economic, cultural, and spiritual environment so that we are not reactive to, misled, or consumed by it. That is to say that each of us exists in a contextual culture shaped by time, space, experience, and circumstance. In order to move forward or fly away towards liberation, however we define that phrase, we must understand with as much specificity as is reasonably possible who we are. It is important to understand how we experience what we are experiencing and why, because with such an understanding, without such an understanding, we are reactive and blind and vulnerable to manipulation. We need to know, to understand, to appreciate, to care for, and to honor the legacies and traumas that we carry. Terrible things have happened, but not everything happened to everybody, and not at the same time, or in the same manner, or to the same degree. The history of racial enslavement and oppression is long and complex. So finally, I would add that we need to know who we are walking beside today, because there are all kinds of traumas impacted individuals in the everyday world around us. Secrecy and shame, mental health issues, survival behaviors, all have serious consequences and are often ripe and untreated within our families and our communities. So I want to mention just a couple things to address the barriers of the work, because the work of identifying and transforming healing of intergenerational and interpersonal trauma are varied and significant. Besides secrecy and denial, barriers such as poor record keeping, destroyed archives, fragmented bureaucracies, and geographical distance can impede efforts to understanding and self-awareness. But there are new and traditional tools at our disposal. Family members can be helpful when asked carefully. Local monuments, museums, historical societies, cultural centers, universities, mortuaries, churches, cemeteries, they all harbor uncelebrated resources like libraries and catalogs, databases, photographs, artwork, maps, and other artifacts and expertise. They are underutilized gems in my experience. And the internet gives us the reach to span geographical distances and communicate with namesakes who are often eager to share stories that illuminate trails and reanimate clues that may have grown cold. People in these fields very often want to be helpful to those of us trying to uncover our pasts. For example, for me, Facebook has enabled me to reach out across the country and to the Caribbean, to Hippolytes that I never knew existed, and for a handful of them to find me. DNA services like Ancestry.com, AfricanAmerican.com, and others can identify connections to Africa, Americas, and Europe much more clearly than previously available. So finally, our ancestors are speaking to us. They're waiting to reveal themselves. And by witnessing them, we not only deepen our understanding and appreciation of true American history, but we honor their personal dignity, resistance, struggle, and sacrifice. By telling their stories can help heal our own intergenerational wounds. We can draw upon the strength, inspiration, and courage they offer us. Knowing where they are buried generates an awareness of the sacrifice and the sacredness of the earth that we walk on. So you can make a deal with the ancestors. You can get to know them as best you can and ask them to share not only their pain, but also their joy, their loves, and their dreams. And you will discover that your precious life is an incarnation of your ancestors' wildest dreams. Remember, we are injured by others, but we must heal ourselves. And I'll stop there and allow time for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hippolyte. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing. And I love this connection of being mindful of the flight that we're on, and so that we're not misled and we're not consumed, but we are actually trying to liberate ourselves and liberate others that are around us. And even as it connected to the Dr. Rooks, when she was talking about the trees, but then the thought that there are trees along our way as resources, whether it is the internet that can help us and help us through our healing, that's amazing, and it's something I hadn't really considered. So thank you for bringing that to us, to remind us who we are and why we are. And as we hear from our next speaker, Dr. Brady, who is not only a professor and a writer, but is also a clinical psychologist. She is a social equity researcher and an organizational consultant. She will share her thoughts with us next.
Thank you so much. I'm going to attempt a screen share in just a moment. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh, it's already not working. Okay. Here we go. So I apologize for what might feel like a very abrupt change of pace with PowerPoint slides, but actually I hope you'll forgive the structure. Much of what Dr. Rooks and Mr. Hippolyte were just sharing is something that actually resonates very much in this project. So I am a clinical psychologist. My area of scholarship has broadly been risk and resilience, and I come to that work through working with marginalized communities, women prisoners, veterans, homeless families, chronic pain patients. And when you work with communities affected by adversity, stigmatized because of various reasons, you appreciate a common healing journey. And so much of what we've just heard resonates for me in the patient stories that I've heard. And in this project, here in the state of New Hampshire, in our most recent budget, we had language from a divisive concepts bill that was passed in our state budget. And that has sweeping and chilling effects on any kind of healing process that an individual or that an institution might engage. Because the base of that divisive concepts effort is one about hiding the very roots and streams that both of the prior speakers were naming. I am a professor in the psychology department at St. Anselm College. And so through our Humanities Institute, the Grapponi Humanities Institute, over this